ఇది మినిమైజ్ చేసేసుకోండి మీ పీడిఎఫ్ లో.
వస్తుందండి. Good afternoon, everybody. Today we are going to discuss regarding radial nerve injury. So radial nerve is a branch from the posterior cord of brachial plexus. The root value is C5678 T1. You can see here that the radial nerve comes as a branch of the posterior cord of brachial plexus. Okay, posterior cord means it passes posterior to third part of the axillary artery. In the axilla it passes through the quadrangular space, and then it passes posterior to the humerus, middle third humerus, in the spiral groove from medial to lateral, and after coming laterally it pierces the lateral intramuscular septum and comes into the anterior compartment of the arm, and in front of the lateral epicondyle it divides into superficial radial nerve and posterior interosseous nerve. So in the axilla it gives branches to triceps, long head, lateral head, medial head, posterior cutaneous nerve of the arm, lower lateral cutaneous nerve of the arm. In the spiral groove, after coming from the spiral groove, it gives branches to the brachioradialis, and before division in front of the lateral epicondyle it gives branch to the extensa carpi radialis longus, and starting from extensa carpi radialis brevis, all the extensors of the forearm of all the extensors on the dorsal aspect of the forearm are supplied by the posterior interosseous nerve, like starting from extensa carpi radialis brevis, supinator, extensa carpi ulnaris, extensa digitorum, extensa digiti minimi, abductor pollicis longus, extensa pollicis longus, extensor indicis. Okay, and the superficial radial nerve, it remains between the brachioradialis and extensa carpi radialis longus, and about 7 cm above the wrist it pierces the deep fascia of the forearm and gives some dorsal digital branches where it supplies the dorsal 2.5 fingers and dorsal half of the palm. Okay, so this is the course of the radial nerve. So before the radial groove it gives branches to the long head and medial heads of triceps. After the radial groove, before crossing the elbow, lateral head of triceps, anconeus, brachioradialis, extensa carpi radialis longus. After crossing the elbow, after dividing in front of the lateral epicondyle, it gives branches to extensa carpi radialis brevis, supinator. After piercing the supinator, it gives branches to the extensor muscles of the forearm and hand. So low lesions due to fracture, dislocation at the elbow or to the local wound, they complain of clumsiness, not being able to extend the MCP joint, metacarpophalangeal joint of the hand. In the thumb, weakness of the extension and retroposition, the wrist extension is preserved. In low lesions, the wrist extension is preserved. In high lesions, that means it is due to fracture of the humerus or after prolonged tourniquet pressure. There is wrist drop. The wrist extension is gone due to weakness of radial extensors of the wrist, like extensor carpi radialis longus and brevis. Inability to extend the MCP joint because of extensor digitorum. Extensor digitorum is gone. Sensory loss over a small patch on the dorsum. Anatomical snuff box. Very high lesions are due to injury to the radial nerve in the axilla. It is because of Saturday night palsy or crutch palsy. High lesions where even the elbow extension with the triceps is paralyzed. So anatomy of the radial nerve, you can see the radial nerve is vulnerable to injury below the spiral groove where there is a fracture of distal third of the humerus shaft. Distal third of the humerus shaft. Why? Because in this area the radial nerve pierces the lateral intramuscular septum and it is held very close to the bone. So that's why the radial nerve is, there are more chances of radial nerve injury in the distal third shaft of humerus. So test for radial nerve, basically the only one test which differentiates the high lesion with the low lesion is to test the brachioradialis. So brachioradialis, how is it tested? Brachioradialis is tested with elbow flexion under resistance with the forearm mid prone. Elbow is flexed to 90 degree and keeping the forearm mid prone. The elbow is further flexed against resistance. If the brachioradialis is involved, it is a high lesion. If the brachioradialis is not involved, it is a low lesion. How to differentiate between high lesions and very high lesions? That means high lesions is the injury to the radial nerve in the spiral groove. Very high lesions is injury to the radial nerve in the axilla. So if the radial nerve is injured in the axilla, even the triceps is also involved. So we check for elbow extension against resistance. So thereby we can differentiate between very high lesion and high lesion. To differentiate between high lesion and low lesion, it is brachioradialis. Wrist extensors. In high lesions, the wrist extensor is gone. Wrist extension is gone, giving rise to wrist drop, like extensor carpi radialis longus, brevis, extensor digitorum. Wrist drop and finger drop, thumb drop. So wrist drop, finger drop, thumb drop. All will be there in high lesions. But in high lesions, because the triceps is supplied in the axilla, triceps is spared. So radial nerve injury results from acute trauma or compression of the radial nerve. You can see here that a person is taking alcohol during Saturday and is leaning on the chair by means of his axilla, by means of his chair into his axilla. This is a Saturday night palsy, giving rise to radial nerve injury in the axilla. This causes very high lesion, type lesion of the radial nerve. So extensor digitorum giving rise to thumb drop. Extensor pollicis longus, if it is involved, it gives rise to thumb drop. If extensor digitorum is involved, it gives rise to finger drop. So what is pin palsy? Pin palsy is posterior interosseous nerve palsy. Posterior interosseous nerve is a branch of the radial nerve, deep branch of radial nerve. Superficial branch of radial nerve is superficial radial nerve. Okay. So pin palsy, it is a pure motor type palsy. There is no sensory involvement because posterior interosseous nerve is a pure motor nerve. Motor nerve means the nerve only supplies the muscles and there is no sensory supply. That means it doesn't supply for any sensation like for the skin. It doesn't supply for any sensory. There is no sensory supply for pin. Pin is a pure motor nerve. So when there is a pin palsy, only the muscular muscle paralysis is there, but there is no sensory disturbance. Okay. So finger metacarpal extension weakness. Why? Because posterior interosseous nerve supplies the extensor digitorum, extensor indicis, extensor pollicis longus, abductor pollicis longus, extensor digiti minimi. That's why there is metacarpal extension loss. Metacarpal extension is gone. That's why there is finger drop. And also there is thumb drop because the extensor carpi, extensor pollicis longus is also gone. Okay. In pin palsy, there is no wrist extension weakness. There is no wrist extension weakness because pin deep branch of the radial nerve, posterior interosseous nerve arises after the extensor carpi radialis longus. So extensor carpi radialis longus takes care of wrist extension. Okay. Now coming to median nerve. Median nerve formed by joining the branches from lateral and medial cords of brachial plexus. Lateral root of median nerve, medial root of median nerve. So median nerve is from the lateral cord, lateral root of median nerve, medial cord, medial root of median nerve. Okay, so median nerve. Median nerve doesn't have any branches in the arm. It doesn't have any branches in the arm. Only some arterial branches to the brachial artery. Only arterial branches of the brachial artery. It gives some branches to the brachial artery. And then in front of the elbow, it passes between the two heads of pronator teres, supplies the pronator teres, flexor carpi radialis, palmaris longus, flexor carpi radialis, palmaris longus, flexor digitorum superficialis, and lateral half of flexor digitorum profundus. Lateral half of flexor digitorum profundus. The deep branch of median nerve is the anterior interosseous nerve. The anterior interosseous nerve supplies the profundus, flexor pollicis longus, and all the thinner muscles of the hand. Thinner muscles are 1. Flexor pollicis brevis, abductor pollicis brevis, opponens pollicis, adductor pollicis. All these 4 muscles are supplied by the anterior interosseous nerve. There are some controversies regarding flexor pollicis brevis and adductor pollicis. How? Because in some people flexor pollicis brevis is supplied by ulnar nerve, and also the transverse head of adductor pollicis is supplied by the ulnar nerve. Okay. So this median nerve gives a palmar cutaneous branch just before it crosses the wrist. Gives a palmar cutaneous branch which supplies the lateral half of the palm and lateral 3½ fingers. So lateral 3½ fingers and lateral half of the palm. So motor branches in the proximal third, all the flexor muscles of the forearm except flexor carpi ulnaris and medial of flexor digitorum profundus, which are supplied by the ulnar nerve. In the hand, it supplies the thenar muscles, first and second lumbricals. First and second lumbricals. So in low lesions, maybe due to cut injury in front of the wrist or by carpal dislocation, unable to abduct the thumb, sensation is lost over the radial 3.5 fingers, and long standing condition gives rise to atrophy of thenar eminence. High lesions, they generally due to forearm fractures, elbow dislocation. Signs in addition to low lesions, the paralysis of the long flexors of the thumb, index, middle fingers, radial wrist flexors, forearm pronators. Typically, hand is held in ulnar fingers flexed and index is straight, which is called pointing index. Pointing index. Why? Because the pointing index means the branch to the index finger, the flexor profundus branch, flexor digitorum profundus branch to the index finger is a independent branch. So that's why, because there is median nerve injury, there is no other collateral branches to the flexor digitorum profundus of the index finger, but the middle ring fingers are supplied by the other belly. It's a separate belly. So that's why there is pointing index or benediction sign. And there is characteristic pinch defect. Pinch defect means patient won't be able to pinch with the help of index and thumb. He won't be able to flex his distal interphalangeal joint of index finger and thumb, which is called Kilon-Nevin sign. Kilon-Nevin, Kilon-Nevin sign. He won't be able to flex both of his index finger distal interphalangeal joint and thumb interphalangeal joint. So that's why it will give rise to Kilon-Nevin sign. Isolated anti-intraosseous nerve lesions are extremely rare, similar to high median nerve injury but without any sensory loss. Tests how to examine for median nerve injury. One is flexor pollicis longus. Flexor pollicis longus, flexion of the distal interphalangeal joint, IP joint of the thumb. Flexor digitorum superficialis and lateral half of flexor digitorum profundus, pointing index. Pointing index. You can see here, pointing index. Flexor carpi radialis. So when we attempt for wrist flexion against resistance, it will go into ulnar deviation. Ulnar deviation. Why? Because the wrist is flexed with the help of flexor carpi radialis and flexor carpi ulnaris. Flexor carpi radialis is supplied by median nerve. Flexor carpi ulnaris is supplied by ulnar nerve. So because there is median nerve injury, flexor carpi radialis does not act. So flexor carpi ulnaris acts because ulnar nerve is intact. So when you attempt a wrist flexion against resistance, the wrist will go into ulnar deviation. Ulnar deviation. Okay. Muscles of thenar eminence. There is some wasting of muscles of thenar eminence. And next, abductor pollicis brevis. Abductor pollicis brevis pen test. Patient is asked to lay his hand and advised to touch the pen with the help of index, thumb, with the help of the thumb. So this is called pen test, which is done with the help of abductor pollicis brevis. Opponent's pollicis, he won't be able to oppose the fingers. This is called Keelan-Evin sign or OK sign. OK sign or Keelan-Evin sign. He won't be able to flex the DIP of index and IP joint of the thumb. So that's why it is. Then next is ape thumb deformity. The thumb becomes in line with the other fingers because of wasting of thenar eminence. The ulnar nerve we will discuss next week. Thank you.